The first new college football playoffs are here, but plenty of people were unhappy before even one game was played, and we've got the solution. Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, where we discuss all things BYU and Big 12. And today we are tackling how to improve the new college football playoff. But before we do, if you are someone who has complaints with the CFP or simply loves college sports, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Spread a little holiday cheer and help us out. All right, before we get started, I've got to say that I'm stoked for the new expanded playoff, and I plan on watching as much as I possibly can get away with. Having said that, there are already some legitimate complaints, and we'll get into those. And I'm going to outline 3 changes we could make to improve the playoff and address these complaints. A quick note, I recorded this video before the playoff games began. Now, there were a lot of blowouts in the first round, and people are pointing fingers at the committee. I don't mean to defend the committee, but blowouts happen. They happen a lot in the 4-team playoff, but also I'm so glad that these teams had the chance to play it out on the field instead of just having to trust that the committee got it right. I'll talk more about this in subsequent videos, but I just needed to acknowledge this and say that my opinions in this video still stand. Number 1, we need an objective ranking system. We need to remove the human element from the rankings. They are full of bias and politics. All rankings are anchored by the preseason polls, which favor big brands. And big brands get the benefit of the doubt, usually getting bigger recruits because, again, they are big brands. And since the bigger brands have consolidated into a couple conferences, they play each other, which then are viewed as quality wins and losses, which further perpetuates their perception as being good teams. For example, Texas beat Michigan early in the season when U of M was still viewed as a quality ranked opponent. This bolstered Texas in the rankings, but Texas didn't beat any other noteworthy teams until A&M in the final week. So it becomes a self-perpetuated echo chamber. Additionally, the criteria they use to rank teams seems to vary depending on which teams are being evaluated. So let's take Boise State, for example. They get a lot of credit for losing a close game to Oregon, who, I might add, played a tight game against the FCS Idaho Vandals the week prior. They also get credit for winning a close game in a tough environment in Laramie, while early in the season, BYU's blowout win over the Cowboys in Laramie was used against them. Let's take Alabama now. Alabama gets credit for good wins while simultaneously ignoring their bad losses. This is just an example of how the SEC's parity gets talked about with reverence while the Big 12's parity hurts them because they don't have any big brands. BYU fans, me, were ticked that they weren't even at least in the conversation for an at-large spot because they had better strength of record than teams that were being considered ahead of them. BYU beat a team that got in, SMU, and lost to a one-possession game against another, Arizona State. Anyway, I'm not going to argue BYU's merit to be included into the playoff in this video. I simply wanted to illustrate that the committee is full of flawed humans with natural biases and other influences, and their rankings have reflected those flaws and have proven to be inconsistent depending on the team. If you want a much longer discussion on these points, check out my other video. I had Jeff Fuller on, and we had a long, lengthy, informative discussion on all of this, so go check that out. I never thought the day would come when I would long for the BCS, but having a composite ranking would be a huge step forward, or backwards. The BCS included the polls, so I would leave the human element out and use analytics that also don't include the polls. And to have an effective composite ranking, you have to define what the ranking criteria are and make it transparent and available for everyone. And then everyone will know what they are being judged on, and it makes it much harder to argue with the results. My preferred system is one like this that essentially mimics the basketball quad system. Now, I don't know exactly how the quads were calculated in this example. Looking at it, BYU is ranked 9, but not considered a quad 1 opponent based on looking at ASU and SMU's records. But if they can determine these using a predetermined composite of analytics that do not include the human element, the polls, or a committee, then you can easily determine how teams should be ranked. And it encourages scheduling quality non-conference opponents as well, because getting those quad 1 wins can really benefit you. With a system like this, we can remove the impossible task of making everyone happy away from the committee and put it back in the hands of the actual players on the field. Our second fix for the CFP would be to go back to 10-team conferences. Obviously, this one is not happening. Not that I think any of my suggestions will happen, but this one is definitely not happening, and I understand that. But I want you to hear me out anyway, because I feel like it would fix so many issues. This is a similar concept to what groups out there like Project Rudy and some of the others have already proposed, and I did a separate video on this on how I would divide the conferences. I'm not going to get into all of that here. You can go check out that video if you want more detail on it, but let me summarize. Taking all the current P4 teams plus Notre Dame plus the Pac-2, there are 70 teams that would be divided nicely into 7 10-team conferences. And here's how I would divide the conferences. Of course, this can be up for debate, but again, that is for another video. My goal was to revert back to the pre-existing conferences as much as possible. The ACC, Big Ten, Pac-10, and SEC all went back to their original members, at least with those members that are still currently FBS and Power or P4 members. The Big East is pretty much back with Notre Dame, who was a member in all other sports, and Penn State, a better regional fit than in the Big Ten and a former conference foe of some of the Big East schools when they were all back in the A10. That just leaves the Big 8 and Southwest Conference with 8 members each and 2 pairs of schools that need a home, BYU and Utah and Miami and UCF. I chose to put the Beehive State schools in the Big 8 and the Sunshine State schools in the Southwest Conference. We could run through the same exercise for the G5 conferences, which would require some relegation to FCS, but you can just imagine that. For the sake of today, I think I'm just going to keep the G5 conferences how they are for the sake of ease and just an example. Another benefit is that the talent amongst the conferences would be spread out more evenly. Using the EA Sport tier rankings based on how teams ranked at the end of each season for the last 10 years prior to this season, I know it's rather basic, but it illustrates the point that keeping in mind that the lower the score is better, we see that the conferences are all pretty similar except the ACC. They still suck. Also, using the average Massey composite score for each conference for this season, we see that there's still a lot of parity amongst all the power conferences. In addition to bringing back more regionality and traditional rivalries, it would also allow conferences to play a round-robin schedule, avoiding the imbalanced schedules we're seeing in these massive conferences. In fact, I would even say every P7 school should play 9 conference games, at least one other P7 school in their non-conference slate, and no more than one FCS opponent. And if I was really going to have my druthers, I would really like to see Jake Hatch's idea come to fruition of moving all FCS games as opponents to the spring and play them as scrimmages, don't have them during the regular season. But again, that is a topic for another day. 10-team conferences is also perfect for basketball, where you can schedule 18 conference games, a home and away versus each of your conference opponents. Of course, that may not be necessary to legislate, because with the quad system, they will be incentivized to play tougher teams in their out-of-conference schedule. An additional benefit of 10-team conferences is that you can name a clear conference champion. Because you play that round robin schedule, it is easier to define the two top teams in the conference to then play in the conference championship game and duke it out. But there will still be ties. While we'll likely avoid these crazy tiebreaker scenarios that the Big 12 saw this year, they will still want to make sure that ties are settled by something on the field as opposed to whatever mess they have to currently decide it. I would prefer some sort of analytical approach to defining that, and again, leave it to the players on the field. And the third thing that we would fix is the playoff format. First, ditch the automatic buys for the top 4 conference champs. It's messy and can actually create a disadvantage for the top seed. Look at this. People argue that Penn State, who lost to Oregon in the conference championship, the Big Ten conference championship, actually has an easier, clearer path than Oregon does. So seed everyone straight up based on rank. Also, all 12 conference champs get in. Yes, even the G5s. By dividing all the teams into regional groups of 10 and named a clear champion from each one, now we pit those champs against each other to name the national champion. Seems fair to me. Win and you're in. It puts the emphasis back on the regular season and in winning games. However, there are some teams that don't win their conference championship that have a pretty good case to get in. For example, if Bama and Georgia both go 12-1, one team winning their matchup in the regular season and the other in the conference championship game. So expand the playoff to 16 teams and let in 4 at-large teams, but still ranking everyone straight up. So the 2 seed could be an at-large school. However, by only including the conference champions, I recognize that some of the top teams in the nation would be left out of the playoff, and some of them having a really good case for getting in. Not to feed into the SEC bias, but let's take an example of Bama and Georgia both going 12-1, one team winning their regular season matchup while the other wins in the SEC conference championship game. So both would have very impressive records, both having won one game against each other. I get it. Both have a pretty strong argument to get in. So expand the playoff to 16 teams and let in 4 at-large teams, still ranking straight up. So hypothetically, the 2 seed could be an at-large school. Now, if you did not win your conference championship game and you are not one of the next top 4 teams in the country, especially using an analytically based ranking system, then your argument for getting into a 16-team playoff all of a sudden is pretty slim. I mean, there's always going to be somebody who's unhappy and feels slighted. There's always got to be a cutoff somewhere. But at that point, that is a pretty inclusive playoff. So here's what this year's playoff would look like by incorporating the changes that we discussed. And so we took those quad rankings, and because all the teams are, at least all the P7 teams are in new conferences, instead of trying to figure out who was the conference champion, because really all their schedules would be different, their records would be different. But what we did is just take the highest ranked team from those rankings from each of the new 7 P7 conferences. And then we just took the G5 teams from as they currently exist and took those actual conference champions, because again, we did not go back and regroup and create new G5 conferences. And for those that weren't included on the rankings, we just went to the Massey Index and to figure out who was seated higher than the others. And so now these were all the conference champions, again, the highest ranked teams from the newly formed 7P7 conferences. And then the 4 at-large schools are those with those little black circles with the gold ring around it. And those were the highest 4 ranked teams that were not also conference champions. And then we seeded everybody straight up. And what we love about this is that it creates a real advantage for the upper seeds. You see that Oregon and Georgia have real advantage in that first round matchup. And don't reseed for the second round. Upsets are fun and already really unlikely, but if Jack State had to beat Oregon, then they deserve to continue on that same path. They shouldn't then have to go beat a Georgia or the next highest ranked team, because it's not going to happen. It's all, the cards are already stacked against them. So I think you just fill it out straight up and let everyone play each other and continue on their path. Plus, we all love filling out our brackets. And first round, obviously a home game. I'm actually an advocate of making the second round a home game as well, and then rotating between the New Year's Six Bowls for the semifinals and the championship game. However, there are some signs already that because students are away, that semesters end, it's hard enough already to fill up these home stadiums for the first round, that the second round might be even tougher. So there might be a case to go ahead and leave it as it's currently structured. I don't know. I'm still open on this point. But if the second round is going to be a bowl game, then I like allowing the top 3 seeds to pick which bowl game belongs in their part of the bracket. For example, Oregon would pick the Rose Bowl because, yes, the history with the Pac-10, but also because it's the closest geographically. Georgia, the Sugar Bowl. Boise State, the Fiesta Bowl. I mean, why would they not want to play in the Fiesta Bowl? And who wants to go up against them playing there? And then the 4th seed, in this case Ohio State, would be left with the 4th bowl in that situation. Of course, teams could get really tactical, and Boise State would say, hey, we don't want to play ASU at the Fiesta Bowl and pick the Peach Bowl instead. But I'm guessing they probably wouldn't overthink it, and I imagine it would look something much like this. So in summary, our changes to the CFP would be get rid of the committee and put in an analytically based ranking system. 2, and this one is the most far-fetched, realign the conferences to 10-team conferences. And then 3, take all of the conference champions from the 12 conferences and 4 at-large teams, rank them straight up and let them go at it, and we will name a national champion. And I think this would be the best solution to fixing the playoff. It addresses many of the issues that we're currently seeing and would allow for a much more fun playoff, and I think be able to name a truer national champion. But what do you think about these ideas? What am I overlooking? Are my ideas garbage, or are they fine but need some tweaking or an additional idea? Please let me know all of those in the comments down below. I love the discussion. And also, if you haven't yet, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy the playoffs. It is going to be tons of fun. And as always, go Cougs.